Okay, anybody who would like to speak? I saw your hand up, Mr. Albus. Or no, Mr. Barcelou-Duval, à vous la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I sent a motion to the clerk this morning. Perhaps the clerk could distribute it to the members of the committee. It's a follow-up to the discussions that I had outside of this meeting with a lot of people. And so I think it should go well since I spoke with a number of you. I'll read it out. That the Standing Committee on Transportation, Infrastructure and Communities establish an agenda structured as follows. A. The committee immediately requests that the chair and the clerk, in accordance with the motion adopted on August 1st, 2025, make public all documents received from the organizations listed. These documents shall be published on the committee's website and distributed in a press release through the Press Gallery Secretariat. 1. PMO, Prime Minister's Office. 2. PCO, Privy Council Office. 3. Canadian Infrastructure Bank. 4. The Department of Housing, including the Office of the Responsible Minister. And 5. The Department of Transportation, including the Office of the Responsible Minister. B. As part of its study on Canada Infrastructure Bank financing for new BC Ferries vessels, the committee will hold 3 additional meetings and call the following witnesses: Davie Shipyard, Ocean Group, Seaspan Shipyards, Irving Shipbuilding, BC Ferries and Marine Workers Union, BC Building Trades, BC Federation of Labour, the Shipyard General Workers Federation, the United Steelworkers, the Canadian Association of Steel Producers, former Minister of Transport Chrystia Freeland, the Minister of Public Safety, as well as officials responsible for reviewing national security issues related to the contract between BC Ferries and the Chinese shipyard merchants industry Weihai Shipyard. Upon completion of its study on the Bank of Canada's financing of new vessels for British Columbia ferries, the committee will immediately undertake a new study on the phenomenon of chauffeur discounting, comprising at least 6 meetings. The committee will summon the Minister of Transportation, the Secretary of State for Labour, and the Secretary of State for Revenue to testify in this study for a minimum of 1 hour each. Other witnesses chosen by the parties will also be invited to appear. Finally, the committee will submit its conclusions and recommendations to the House. So, this basically means returning to the essential of to the base of what we said around BC Ferries, making the documents public that we received, without including the documents from BC Ferries. Perhaps we could discuss those another time. And undertaking a study on the chauffeur issue. I think that's a big problem in the transportation trucking industry right now. I wrote to Minister McKinnon about this week, and I think there's a lot of interest. People want to see that Parliament is taking this seriously, and that's something that I care very much about as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Barcelou-Duval. Mr. Calloway and then Mr. Muse.
Thank you for that. It's obviously very detailed and very lengthy, so if we can, I know a copy is being circulated, I believe, Chair. And we would request just to suspend for just a little bit to read it. It's very detailed. So if that's possible, so we can huddle to take a look at it and go through it with a fine eye.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Calloway. Before I suspend, did you want to speak after I suspend to give a chance for people to review it, or you'd like to speak to this now, Mr. Muse?
I just want to make a friendly amendment to include Ontario Shipyards in the list of people we will call.
Okay. Why don't we allow for that friendly amendment because it might actually help guide discussions? Go ahead, Mr. Muse.
It's a friendly amendment.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a friendly amendment. Go ahead.
Proposing a friendly amendment.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh.
Ontario Shipyard. Ça marche? Okay. So, colleagues, I just got confirmation from the clerk that it has been circulated. It should be in your inboxes. I'm going to suspend for a couple of minutes to give members who haven't read it yet a chance to do so. The meeting is suspended to the call of the chair. To you, did you want your hand up, Mr. Kellaway, or is there anybody else who wanted their hand up?
I'll defer to Will here on this one.
Did you want to go ahead, Will, and then Mr. Albus?
Thank you, Chair. Just with respect of the proposed motion, I'm struck by the fact that in our meetings earlier this summer, this committee had the opportunity to add or to put questions rather to the relevant ministers from not only the Federal Department of Transport but also Housing and Infrastructure Canada. And it's not clear to me, Mr. Chair, what other questions would be asked of the minister if they were recalled before this committee, given the time and interrogation that's already been spent on the matter. The Minister of Transport, the former Minister of Transport in particular, is no longer in that role and is taking on another significant role on behalf of the Government of Canada. What value or what additional information does this committee anticipate getting from the former minister if she was to be recalled as a witness isn't clear to me, and doesn't seem to be the most efficient use of either this committee's time or of that honourable colleague's time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greaves. I have Mr. Albus, suivi par Mr. Barcelona-Duval.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the floor. And to the honourable member from Victoria, I will be happy to tell him what has changed. I read today, published September 18th, 2025, by Bill Curry, Deputy Ottawa Bureau Chief of the Globe and Mail. BC Ferries deals raised with Transport Canada weeks before Freeland's criticism, emails show. The fact that the CEO, if this report is accurate, the fact that the CEO of BC Ferries, 6 weeks ahead of the announcement about their controversial purchase of 4 ferries from a state-owned shipyard in the People's Republic of China, that he flagged it with the Deputy Minister of Transport Canada, the highest on the nonpartisan side of that department, flagged it with him, was critical that the minister was saying one thing, saying she was shocked. Mr. Chair, this says to me, it's a damning indictment, because Transport Canada was made aware of 6 weeks before that announcement, and they did nothing to protect Canadian jobs. They just sat on their hands and let it proceed. They didn't act to secure those contracts. They didn't push back at it. This raises a number of questions about former Minister Chrystia Freeland's abrupt resignation, and blows a hole in her narrative that she wanted BC Ferries to buy Canadian and was dismayed and upset about it. She said these things on the floor of the House of Commons when myself and other members raised concerns about this procurement. So, Mr. Chair, we need to get to the bottom of this. This government has not been level with British Columbians and with Canadians in general. They say, hand on heart, we want to buy Canadian. Canada's strong. Let's work together. Let's build things here faster, better than we've ever done. And yet they were given a heads up by the CEO of BC Ferries and did nothing. So we need to get to the bottom of this. Chrystia Freeland should come and testify and exactly explain herself how she could say one thing on the floor of the House of Commons. And as far as I understand, she's still a sitting MP. I'm sure now, as a former minister, she has the time to work with us so she can explain herself. Mr. Chair, this just reiterates the need to cancel this loan. $1 billion of taxpayer money that is going to a PRC shipyard. I am sick to my stomach that this is what the government has done in this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Albus. Prochainement, j'ai Mr. Barcelona-Duval, suivi par Mr. Greaves. Mr.
Mr.
Barcelona-Duval.
Barcelona-Duval, followed by Mr. Greaves. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, as for Mr. Greaves' question, indeed, well, I could resume the comments of my Conservative colleague, but the only minister that we would ask to come back, the former minister, Mrs. Freeland, Mr. Robertson already came and he wouldn't be convened again, and the Minister of Public Safety never did come before this committee to speak to this matter. And the reason why I think it's important that Ms. Freeland return is because there are major new facts that we have learned since her last appearance before the committee. Ms. Freeland wrote a letter, and she said loud and clear that she disagreed with Canadian money going towards purchasing Chinese ships. And in fact, we're learning now that she was aware of everything. She knew very well that it was a contract that was up and coming long before it was awarded, and it was being funded with federal money. So the narrative that was created this summer before us in this committee was that, this happened while the government was no longer sitting, it wasn't operating, there was an election, and then we were just put before a fait accompli. So now we're learning that for some time, her and her team were aware, and perhaps even other departments. And what's even more frustrating is that her letter that was published throughout all the media, while in fact that was just nonsense, and it took people for idiots. So I'd like to have her here to explain herself. Thank you, Mr. Bassler-Duval. Next, Mr. Greaves.
Mr. Chair, it's instructive to hear our colleagues across kind of outline what their objections are, because if we apply just the slightest bit of pressure, I think we start to see their argument really fraying at the seams. A basic reminder to our colleagues, BC Ferries is a provincial entity. It is a corporation, the primary shareholder of which is the government of British Columbia. It does not report to the Federal Minister of Transport. And I think it's an unfortunate and indeed somewhat alarming precedent to suggest that federal agencies, federal entities, especially those who are intended to operate arm's length from government, should in fact be pulled into this political bickering and be made ultimately a punching bag for other purposes. The agenda of our Conservative colleagues is very clear. They're on the record about this. They are demanding not only the cancellation of a loan, and I'll return to that in a moment, which is utterly essential towards BC Ferry's ability to continue to provide a critical service on the west coast of this country. But this is really just a Trojan horse for the broader agenda, very clearly articulated that the Conservative Party wishes the abolition of the entire Canadian Infrastructure Bank. BC Ferries is being used as a vehicle to advance a broader agenda, which is a multi-year vendetta against a federal entity that, as we speak, is in the midst of funding critical investments in infrastructure across this country. The CIB is a federal agency, Mr. Chair, but it also does not report to the Federal Minister of Transport. And so both of the arm's length agencies at issue in this matter are not in fact accountable to the minister, the former minister, that my colleagues opposite are demanding return towards this committee. So it is, I think, somewhat confusing, not least of which if we interrogate the fact that this is a loan, Mr. Chair. The money that the Canadian Infrastructure Bank independently decided to allocate towards BC Ferries to support their investment in fleet renewal is a loan that will be repaid with interest. That is the business model of the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. And so this entire project is not one that will cost Canadian taxpayers money in the long run. It is, in fact, an initiative that will generate benefit to the public purse, and in the process, of course, will provide improvements to a service that is completely critical in my part of the country. And in that respect, I will simply underscore again a point that I've made in this committee previously, that we are in fact playing politics here with a service that British Columbians rely upon, that my constituents in Victoria require for daily life. This is not just an abstract matter. This is what gets food and essential goods to Vancouver Island, home to more than 800,000 Canadians. This is a service that underpins the economy of Western Canada. This is a service that provides 33 million rides every year, dwarfing by an order of magnitude the total number of passengers who ride passenger ferries in Atlantic Canada on an annual basis. So there are indeed issues related to BC Ferries that I would be very keen for this committee to take up, not least of which being the inequitable funding afforded to ferries on the West Coast as compared to our Atlantic Canadian cousins. But the issue at hand here, Mr. Chair, is really using for political expedience something that British Columbians cannot afford to have delayed, cannot afford to have undermined. And so on behalf of my constituents in Victoria, on behalf of my colleagues who represent the majority of British Columbians, this is a political exercise that we're engaging in, which is using something that we rely on in British Columbia in service of a broader political objective of our Conservative colleagues, which is to undermine and ultimately destroy a federal agency that is providing funds to the benefit of the federal taxpayer in British Columbia and elsewhere across Canada. I don't think it's appropriate, and I don't think we should indulge in it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greaves. Next, I have Mr. Muse.
Thank you. Let me amplify some of the comments made by my colleagues, Mr. Elvis and Mr. Barcelou-Duval. There are new facts, and that's why this motion has been put forward. But, I don't think it's political to be fighting to protect Canadian jobs. I mean, I come from the Hamilton region, where the steel industry has been absolutely devastated with the unjust tariffs. And why, if we're spending $1 billion that's being backstopped by Canadian taxpayers, is that not going to be Canadian steel produced in Hamilton that's being used, rather than of course this going overseas to China. In fact, speaking of then Minister Freeland, she held a half-day photo op summit in Hamilton at ArcelorMittal Dofasco to buy Canadian. So I guess that was all politics too. So because what actually was accomplished by a half-day photo op summit. By the way, there were shipbuilders there. There was rail there, and they talked about the need to use Canadian steel. That's why it was held at Dofasco. So I think here we've got a great example here, and it'd be great to ask further questions about what transpired there and the discussions around that, because there is again these new facts, and so it's appropriate to delve further into this with this motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muse. Mr. Lawrence.
Thank you, and I'll just respond to start out by responding to some of the points Mr. Graves made. They're relied on a series of logical fallacies. I think I can put it kindly. So, first of all, his first point is that somehow, if in fact we don't buy this ferry from a Chinese contractor, we can't have a ferry. That's simply untrue. You know what? The Liberals may not believe in Canadian manufacturing, but Conservatives do.
Hear, hear.
We believe that those ferries can be built by Canadian hands with Canadian steel. They may not believe that's true, but we do. Secondly, he says, well, there's no federal control. There's no federal relationship between BC ferries. Untrue. The CIB, of course, is underwriting it in terms of $1 billion, and that's a Crown corporation. And if Crown corporations aren't responsible to taxpayers, who are they responsible to? Secondly, in the documents, it says there's numerous times, and I can provide you the citations, when federal bureaucrats talk about the federal flows that are coming directly to BC ferries. And quite frankly, one of the reasons why we need to have further conversations about this is the fact that a lot of those documents get to a certain point and then they're redacted. There are literally hundreds of pages of redactions that I would like to know what's under there. There might be some information in there that is commercially sensitive, and that's fine, but we need to test that evidence. And then he says, you know what, well, why are you asking for former Minister Freeland, who we really should have is a housing minister? Add it. We're happy to have him come and have him discuss again some of the redactions as well. We will gladly accept that amendment to add that minister. The reality is, these documents, it's not really what we know from these documents, it's what they've unveiled that we don't know. There are discussions amongst bureaucrats talking about the impact that the canceling of this loan will have on Canadian PRC relations. That's challenging, because we shouldn't be looking at that Civil servants shouldn't be looking at shouldn't be looking at tenders and going, okay, well, we should allow this loan to go ahead, or we should allow this contract to go ahead because it may affect relationships otherwise. No, we should be trying to get the best ferries, underwriting the best loans. And finally, something that for the BC audience out there, and I believe Mr. Graves is a BC MP, that I'm surprised, quite frankly, he's not surprised that he doesn't want to find out more about this, is in there. It completely redacts the BC Hydro documents and their report completely. This is tens of pages. But you know what? They forgot to redact some of it. They are saying that the cost of having electric ferries will cost BC taxpayers $500 million. That's a lot of money. That is a lot of money to upgrade their facilities. So there's a lot of unknown things in there, and quite frankly, I would say to my colleagues across the board, this is something that deserves many, many meetings. And I think the block motion is flawed, not because it's including BC ferries, but because we don't have enough meetings from it. There's a lot more to told. Just the hundreds of pages of redaction. Like, do you have no curiosity about what's behind that in that blackout? Because I certainly do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawrence. Next, I have Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. So I just want to highlight that this investigation is not about casting the CIB in a certain light. It's really about bringing transparency to Canadians who are asking a lot of questions about what happened and who have a genuine interest in just knowing what happened and what the story is behind how these ships got the contract got sent over to Beijing. So in question period, when this contract first came up, it was revealed that a Chinese shipyard got the contract, and Minister Freeland brushed this off as a provincial matter and said that they only fund operations. But at the very same time, her staff were emailing the Prime Minister's office about how to manage the CIB announcement loan. Parliament was in some sense misled. Canadians expect the truth from their government, not political positioning to cover for some aspect of what appears to be incompetence. And that's why these documents need to be disclosed to the public, and the study needs to happen. The Liberals also told Canadians that Ottawa knew nothing and had nothing to do with the BC Ferries Chinese state-owned shipyard contract. But now we know that the Canada Infrastructure Bank, a federal crown corporation, actually bankrolled and subsidized the interest rates and gave interest rates far below that which Canadians can secure on their own for contracts. And so this is of serious interest to the Canadian public. Instead of transparency, Liberals chose to deflect and deny and almost spin what had happened. And Canadians deserve transparency to know why their tax dollars are being invested in a Chinese-owned shipyard and not in their own shipyard industries and workers. In addition, the Canada Infrastructure Bank was supposed to invest in Canadian infrastructure. Instead, it put a $1 billion loan for ships built in China with zero Canadian content requirements. That's not building Canada and for building Canadians. That's really building Beijing. Why wasn't a single question asked of the CIB about protecting Canadian jobs and shipyards before signing the check? Canadians also need to know more about the timeline of events and how it was only in June that we found out that the contract was going to the Chinese shipyard when decisions were made fairly early in January. Also, how did the CIB not publicly announce the deal before they signed the check? And why did they wait so long before announcing? Those are other questions that Canadians are curious about.
Point of order? Sorry,
Dr. Lewis, give me 1 second. I have a point of order from Ms. Wehan.
I'm curious this is that we've had these questions and explored them when we invited the CIB CEO to talk. Sorry.
Sorry, Ms. Whedon.
Okay.
That's not a point of order, that's a debate. And if you want the floor, I can put your name down.
Okay. Sorry. My apologies.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Whedon. Sorry, Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And essentially, what we got back from the Liberals were pages and pages of blacked out documents. And the documents from the BC Ferries tell a very different story than what the Transport Minister told to Parliament. At the end of the day, Canadians deserve straightforward answers. And that's why this investigation is essential and is needed. The disclosed documents raise more questions than they do answers, and some of them are: when exactly did the Liberals know about this deal? Why did they not do more to act when they were alerted to the deal by BC Ferries? When exactly did Minister Freeland know the contract was going to China and that the CIB was bankrolling it? When exactly did the housing minister become aware of the same? Why were Canadian bidders ignored and no priorities or procurement processes laid out to ensure Canadian bidders were included? Why were national security interests ignored and played down by this Liberal government? Conservatives are calling for a complete and full committee investigations. Canadians deserve accountability, and they deserve full disclosure. Full disclosure of the $1 billion deal at a time when our workers and economy are suffering. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. Next I have Mr. Kellaway, followed by Ms. Whedon. Mr. Kellaway.
Thank
and
you.
Mr. Greaves.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. And so interesting discussion. Let's talk about a few things that were mentioned just recently. So at the beginning of the meeting, I talked about collaboration, and we talked about working together. And there's a couple of things that we need to clarify here. One, I don't know if there's anyone around the table that's not pro-Canadian, pro-Quebec, who wants to focus on jobs for our people, who wants to focus on major projects for our people. It's beyond disingenuous to suggest another party doesn't. And that's an overreach, and that's what sometimes you guys do. You overreach, you go too far, you make comments that you shouldn't, especially in this type of environment. So I want to highlight that. Number two, perhaps we'll get to this at some point down the road. We are here, and we're all here to look at this particular study. It's now an investigation. Heard a lot of things today that were called facts. See that a lot on social media. Fact, fact, fact. And in many cases, it's an educated assumption, or it's an assumption altogether. We've had ministers come in. We have had talk to them. They've provided their insight. I can appreciate, and I'll take everyone at their word, that they want to bring people in to hear where there might have been a breakdown in communication. Let's talk about that. But there comes a point when, and I hope this doesn't come this way, and I don't think it is right now, that becomes a bit of everyone wanting to be a bit of Wordsworth and Woodward and Bernstein. And sometimes you got to be a little bit more, and I put this on all of us, thoughtful in terms of how we go about doing this. So I would caution members, respectfully, to not state their fact. There are timelines here. We need to talk about those. And, Mr. Curry had some really interesting information, didn't he? Not sure where he got that from. Interesting. It's interesting for Canadians to ask those questions, too. But they should also ask questions around BC Ferries. And they should also ask questions around, how did this happen? We want to know. We're pro-Canadian. I want to see jobs. I want to see shipyards in BC and in Quebec and Atlantic Canada produce jobs, building Canadian ferries for BC Ferries. That's important. That's necessary. So, you know, I've read speeches before. Some of them I've edited. Some of them I read verbatim. Some of them are my own. This is my own. You know, we are going to go ahead with a study that's now turned into an investigation that already has facts. It's already built in, right? And what does that feed? It starts to feel a little like social media, doesn't it? And I'm not absolving the fact that I want to know how BC Ferries didn't have their thinking cap on with respect to knowing that this is a potential, not potential problem, a problem. You know, we had Minister Freeland come in, she spoke. We had CIB, they spoke. The things are redacted. Here's the thing. Things are redacted. Why? Natural assumption, something to hide. I don't know what's redacted. I don't know if it's commercial. I don't know if it's military. I don't know if it's personal. I agree, we should look at that. That's common sense, as the Conservatives say. It's also what Mick Kellaway used to say when he would go underground in the pit. A lot of things are common sense. So basically what I'm saying is let's stop with the rhetoric that there's one party that's pro-business. Like, we made fun just a few moments ago of a photo op with respect to a hackathon on trucking. How do you bring people together to discuss the art of the possible, help Canadians, put more money in people's pocketbooks? Well, you bring them together. And guess what? There's cameras there. And they take pictures. And it's not just the minister that wants the picture, it's the proponents as well, to show the people back home we're fighting for Canadian jobs. We're fighting for the Canadian economy. So I know it's easy to get really kind of into the fight, but I think we need to watch just the phrases that we use. And you're going to have your clips. We're going to have our clips. Praise be. Fantastic. But when it comes back to one of the central themes of Minister Freeland, if we lose this vote and she comes in, I have no doubt in my mind she will be strong and lay out her facts. You can grill her. You can play whatever kind of game you may want to play in a very hopefully thoughtful way. So we do want to get some of that information, if not all the information. It's how we do it. And I want to go back to a couple of things. Because you don't know and I don't know what was redacted, you know, we need to be very, again, thoughtful of how best we review that. And there are ways to do that. There are ways to do that that we see, that you see, I believe, that would be ethical, upfront, and with Canadians in front and center, while at the same time knowing that there has to be reasons for why those things were redacted. I want to know why. You want to know why. So I'll conclude with this. I know we've got some more hands up, but I believe that everyone is pro-worker, everyone is pro-business, and we're dealing with the situation here. We're also dealing with a larger situation in terms of why there's this talk of collaboration in Canada, why premiers are working with the federal government, is because we are at a moment, an inflection point in our economy and our life. I'll leave it at that and yield the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kellaway. Ms. Wien, did you want to speak or did you? Yep. Okay, Ms. Wien, followed by Mr. Greaves, suivi par Mr. Lauzon.
No, on my apologies, I'm still learning what the parliamentary process is, and so I apologize if I used incorrectly or used a point of order. I wanted to note, though, that we have heard the timeline and that the work to procure the BC ferries, that opportunity started many years ago and was delayed in COVID. And so it's not as though this decision was made quickly in the timelines of in the moment of where we were. That work had been done to get to that place. And so that's all I wanted to kind of correct or make sure that I had understood from the witness testimony back in the summer.
So, as the chair is indisposed at the moment, I'm going to take over and give myself the floor. Oh, he's coming. Okay.
That was a good
I tried to help you out there, Pete.
Mr. Albus, you wanted the floor, sir?
Yes, please. So, I find
Is
it.
this a point of order?
No. I thought she was done.
Oh, you're
There's
done.
a list. There's a list.
Oh, there's list. There's Mr.
Albus,
Greaves
come on,
next,
come to order.
followed by Mr.
Okay.
Dozon, followed by you, Mr. Albus. Thank you, sir. Mr. Greaves.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of points to clarify and to speak to raised by my Conservative colleagues. The first is the critical point to underscore in all of this is that this was a decision made by BC Ferries about their own business. And not just that, it's a decision that was taken before the most recent election. So it's false on the face of it to accuse, as the members have, that this government was implicated in this decision in some respect. It was not. The decision was taken before this government had received the mandate from Canadians to govern in this 45th Parliament. The second point I'd like to make, Mr. Chair, is that we hear a great deal from our Conservative colleagues about their concerns for the Canadian steel sector and the workers whose livelihoods have been, of course, affected by the trade war that's been thrust upon us by Donald Trump and his administration. And this is a point that the government, of course, takes very seriously, and that I fully agree with my honourable colleague from Cape Breton, is something that I think we should give the benefit of the doubt to everyone on this committee, that we are all committed to supporting Canadian jobs and that we're also committed to supporting the Canadian steel sector in this challenging time. But it has to be said yet again, although we have heard this from our witnesses, and so our colleagues are well aware, that no Canadian shipyards actually put in bids to bid and build these ferries. We've been told that if they had received the contracts, if Canadian shipyards had in fact bid and received the contracts, that it would have cost billions of dollars more and taken more than a decade longer to deliver these ferries than the procurement agreement that was ultimately struck. Never mind the British Columbians who rely on these ferries every day and need them to be replaced, don't have a decade to waste. I'm fascinated by this Conservative position, somewhat novel, I must say, that it's in the public interest to spend more money than necessary on procurement decisions. Is this a new position for our Conservative colleagues, that we should spend more money rather than choosing the lowest bidder, that we shouldn't get maximum value for public money? And if we were to then synthesize our colleagues' position on this matter, it amounts to, number one, the federal government should interfere and undermine the strategic planning of provincial agencies, and two, that the federal government should not seek to get the best value for public money. This is, I think, an interesting position for our Conservative colleagues to hold. But this position would at least have some integrity if it were consistently applied. And yet, Mr. Chair, I'm not aware of the members on this committee summoning ministers and demanding documents during the previous Parliament when the most recent new ferry acquired for the Atlantic coast was in fact procured from the same shipyard. So we do seem to have a very selective outrage being directed at BC Ferries with respect to this procurement that has not been raised in the very recent past about an acquisition of a similar ferry for the Atlantic coast of Canada. And I think the people of British Columbia, Mr. Chair, have a right to know why it is that our ferry procurement decisions deserve such scrutiny, especially such scrutiny on the basis of principles that are not particularly conservative, if I may say so, principles that undermine the autonomy of independent agencies, principles that don't actually support getting maximum value for money spent. This is a fascinating position for our colleagues to hold. And so For all these reasons, what we are seeing here is a politically motivated attack on BC Ferries that serves a broader agenda and is using a critical service and a core piece of infrastructure that supports the economy and well-being of Western Canada and Western Canadians to score political points in this vendetta to undermine the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. And so this is simply not something that is in the interest of my constituents or, I would suggest, in the public interest. And my final point on this, Mr. Chair, is we've heard a great deal from some of our Conservative colleagues about how this is a state-owned Chinese shipyard and how this procurement is therefore funding those dastardly communists in China. And while I assure you I have absolutely limited sympathy for the Chinese government and for the communist regime in China, I think it's worthwhile that our Conservative colleagues are consistently overlooking the fact that China is Canada's second largest trading partner, and that as we sit here, Conservative members and Conservative premiers are demanding with their full voices that the Government of Canada engage with the Chinese government in order to relieve the burden of tariffs that are punishing Canadian farmers and Canadian agricultural producers in the context of this global trade war that we find ourselves in. And so while our colleagues are at great pains to vilify the Chinese government in the service of attacking BC Ferries, it's not really consistent with the actual relationship that Canada has with China, our second largest trading partner, nor is it consistent with the many efforts that other Conservative elected officials at both the federal and provincial levels are actively undertaking now to improve our relationships with the Chinese government so that we can regain access for Canadian agricultural products to the largest market in the world. So there are, to put it mildly, Mr. Chair, some holes in the Conservative argument today, and I repeat my basic point that in that context, BC Ferries is being used as a political punching bag that is not in the service of British Columbians and is not something that I or my constituents in Victoria can support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greaves. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Lauzon. À vous la parole.
Mr. Lauzon, over to you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, to piggyback on my colleagues' comments, of course, the CIB has a very important role in the current situation by offering loans, long-term loans at competitive rates. And of course, the idea is to help it with the private and public sectors and in the provinces. Now, to lessen the financial burden, that's the role. But the minister was clear. When present, everybody agrees, everybody's in good faith. We would have preferred a Canadian product made at home with Canadian steel. But what we have to remember is that during the process, it includes offering loans to a provincial jurisdiction coming from the private sector. That part was explained very clearly. What our colleague Mr. Albus said earlier is that it gives us the impression that we were negotiating in good faith directly with China to give them that contract, and that's completely false. What we must understand is that there were very specific criteria during the discussions. First of all, what my colleague Will told us, it is an essential service for British Columbia. It's more than just a ferry. It's a question of accessibility, not just for, trade and so on, but for tourism, among other things. That much is clear. It's also an economic pillar. It's an environmental project because you'll recall it was explained to us very clearly by BC Ferries that the fleet in general is so outdated that there was a lot of money and time sunk into repairs. And so today, these are factors that affect all of us. We all agree that it's better for the environment. And let's not forget, if the amounts of money go beyond the amounts laid out for the purchase of these ferries, well, the bill is sent directly to Canadians. And so these are important facts, important pieces that were relayed to the committee. Now, that being said, the federal government's mandate. Ms. Freeland explained this very clearly to us. The Canadian Infrastructure Bank offers financial support but does not dictate how the ships must be built. That was clear from the get-go. Now, Ms. Freeland laid out what was preferred, and the reality today is that the ships will be coming from a Chinese shipyard. These are two very different things. So we can, we can play politics here and say, yes, we want Canadian steel, but we cannot, detach ourselves from our responsibilities with the CIB. Now, can we change the governmental management rules when we're talking about the Canadian government? And do we want to go further in our process of changing Canadian standards around calls for tenders? This is a whole other debate. But the debate that we're having today is critical for maintaining the study that we have underway on the situation surrounding BC Ferries. And the minister, once again, we want her to come back. Why? Because it's being said that, because basically you want to play politics based on a provincial decision that, has to do with, video clips and social media so the public can see. And the whole goal is to say that the government was irresponsible in the decision it made through the existing process, the one that we have right now. The process is very straightforward. The responsibility is clearly that of the federal government, and the federal government does not intervene in the process managed by BC Ferries. BC Ferries came and explained to us the call for tender process. That process that was put in place by BC Ferries did not exclude Canadian companies. And for my colleague, Mr. Berceau-Duval, Quebec companies, including Davies in our province. Now, there was a call for pre-qualifications. Everyone was invited. But it's not up to us at the committee or in the federal government to establish the criteria for the delivery, the order book, and so on. No, this is internal administration that is, BC Ferries takes care of. And the minister was very clear on that. What could we get out of her beyond that? I have no idea. And what was redacted, well, maybe we'd like to know more, but let's not forget that communications are part of a business strategy between the province, that is to say BC Ferries. This is a commercial strategy, so a number of those strategies, well, these are public-private arrangements, and they don't want that to be public information because it could compromise the future competitivity of our businesses. And if you talk to any business on the market, when we're talking large amounts of money like this, none of them would wish to share sensitive information around their own business's business plan. And it's clear, it's obvious that that would have to remain confidential. Now, as for the debate on this, the choice of supplier needs to be made by BC Ferries and the provincial government and not by the federal government. So I don't even know where we're headed with this. I've been listening all along. I could perhaps bring forward a recommendation through an amendment, following what's been done so far. For the amendment, I'd like to table an amendment, Mr. Chair, if you allow me to do so. Thank you. It's understood that the Bloc and the Conservatives already prepared this motion, but I think there could be consensus to modify Section C, the funding by CIB, the new ships for BC Ferries, for a loan with the CIB. Now, the second modification, we could change Section C. Now, here it says to summon the minister. I just gave you the context. 3, modify Section B, funding for a loan to. It's a loan. It's not fund. It's not free funding. 4, delete 12 in Section B completely. Remove it. And I'll send you all of this through your P9, through the clerk, in both official languages. I'll send it out to you. And I think that at this stage, with what I listed before, I think it would be wise to accept these amendments. However, if you'd like to take a bit of time to discuss that, it's fine by me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Lauzon.
A couple minutes so that will give you an opportunity to review the proposal put forward by Monsieur Lauzon. And I'll suspend for a couple of minutes until such time as members are ready to resume. The meeting is suspended to the call of the chair. Okay, colleagues, I think there have been some discussions offline here. Does anybody want to speak to this? Oui, Monsieur Barcel-Duval, à vous la parole.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank
J'aurais
you, Mr. Chair. I have a sub-amendment to put forward, which would be in response to Mr. Lauzon's amendment around number 12. Instead of eliminating the 12th point under my motion, in fact, we'd say that the interpreter points out that she does not have the changed text. We would instead say that these witnesses would testify in camera. So that's, since it has to do with national security, it could be done that way. Thank you very much, Mr. Barcel-Duval. Mr. Lauzon. Yes. Well, following our discussion, I think we agree with Mr. Barcel-Duval's sub-amendment. Any other discussion? No?
Allow the friendly amendment to change their amendment, then we will discuss their amendment, correct?
I see no objection to the friendly amendment to Mr. Lauzon's amendment, and now we'll have a discussion on Monsieur Lauzon's amendment. If we're all in accordance, we all agree? Okay, the floor is open to now discuss Mr. Lauzon's amendment. Discussion, commentaire?
Discussions or comment?
Yes, Mr. Albus?
So I just wanted to confirm, Mr. Chair, that the only real changes are technical changes, with the exception of we're going to have the Minister of Public Safety for an hour in the open and then another hour with officials. That's essentially the most substantive change, but there's some minor editorial changes. Is that correct?
I believe that's the case. I'll ask Mr. Lauzon to confirm
That's
it is
the
his
case.
amendment. Okay.
But we should expect all other ministers to come in as written in Xavier's motion, correct?
The clerk and I will obviously do all the work necessary to make sure that that happens.
Good. Okay, just clarify.
Is it beneficial for the members to reread the amendment, including Mr. Barcel-Duval's friendly amendment, or are we good to go? I think we're good to go. We're good to go? Okay. So we want to go to a vote on the amendment first? We'll do that. Okay, so we'll go to a vote. Oh, sorry, Mr. Greaves, go ahead.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, just to clarify whether the amendment or the proposed friendly revision to the amendment does also, I believe, remove the ministers of revenue and labor from the list. Is that correct? Or are they still included amongst the ministers to be summoned?
That was part
to
of
be
what was
invited,
put
excuse me,
forward,
let
so
me
I'll
clarify.
leave it. I have Mr. Barcel-Duval's hand up, and then I'll turn over to Mr. Lauzon. Mr. Barcel-Duval.
En fait,
In fact, to Mr. Greaves' question, that's not what I understood in the amendment brought forward by Mr. Lauzon. Perhaps I misunderstood his original amendment, but the Secretary of State for Labor and Revenue, well, they have a role to play when it comes to, well, the discounted chauffeurs. There is an aspect connected with work insurance and so on. So this would be something that would be good to know what kind of leadership these ministers have, or what these secretaries have, or what their role entails currently. Thank you, Mr. Barcel-Duval. Mr. Greaves? Mr. Lauzon and then Mr. Greaves. Indeed, what I read was deleting Section 12 under Section B, including all elements of Section 12. Now, Mr. Barcel-Duval, you said that you'd like a sub-amendment, but we'd have to remove the minister, well, from Section C. Just a minute, hold tight. So that the Minister of Revenue and of Workers have changed. Now that section would have to be removed under Section 12, under Section B.
Merci, Mr. Lauzon. Mr. Greaves.
I was just going to request that perhaps the clerk could read out the amendment so we could all have clarity about what is or is not being considered here. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so the clerk would need about a minute or so to be able to put all that together. While he's doing that, I'll turn the floor over to you, Mr. Albus.
Yeah, if the Liberals are trying to remove multiple ministers from presiding, including, it sounds to me you've relented on the fact that we're going to have the Minister of Public Safety for an hour public. That to me is fine. But if you're asking for the Minister of Labor and for the Secretary of State for CRA to be removed, that is intolerable. It actually removes the whole state that we are trying to have some public disclosure and accountability. And if you do not have those ministers there, it is a substantial change to the amendment or to the motion. So,
Thank you very much, Mr. Albus. Anybody else wish to speak to this? If not, I can suspend for a minute or two until I get indication from the clerk that he's ready to reread.
and just one other thing too is that Madam Freeland should be invited. So if that is not part of that, then that is a problem for us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Albus. What I'll do, colleagues, I'm going to suspend for 1 minute. Shouldn't be more than that. The clerk's just making sure that he's able to reread the motion with the amendment, so we have a better understanding of what we would be voting for. So the meeting will suspend to the call of the chair. The motion as amended by Mr. Lauzon. Mr. Clerk.
So the motion as amended reads as follows: that the Standing Committee on Transportation, Infrastructure, and Communities establish an agenda structured as follows. A, the committee immediately requests that the chair and the clerk, in accordance with the motion adopted on August 1st, 2025, make public all documents received from the organizations listed. These documents shall be published on the committee's website and distributed in a press release through the Press Gallery Secretariat. 1. PMO 2. PCO, 3. CIB, 4. The Department of Housing, including the Office of the Responsible Minister, 5. The Department of Transportation, including the Office of the Responsible Minister. B. As part of its study on Canada Infrastructure Bank's financing of new vessels for BC Ferries, the committee will hold 3 additional meetings and call the following witnesses. 1. Davy Shipyard. 2. Ocean Group. 3. Seaspan Shipyards. 4. Irving Shipbuilding. 5. BC Ferries and Marine Workers Union. 6. BC Building Trades. 7. BC Federation of Labor. 8. The Shipyard General Workers Federation. 9. United Steelworkers. 10. The Canadian Association of Steel Producers. The committee will immediately undertake a new study.
And the Ontario Shipyards, that was one that was added in.
And the Ontario.
Good call, Dan.
C. The committee will immediately undertake a new study on the phenomenon of chauffeur discounting, comprising at least 6 meetings. The committee will invite the Minister of Transportation to testify in this study for a minimum of 1 hour. Other witnesses chosen by the parties will also be invited to appear. Finally, the committee will submit its conclusions and recommendations to the House.
Oui, Mr. Ambassador Duval.
Oui, en fait, je suis
Yes. In fact, I'm not quite in agreement with what's read. I understood that we were also inviting the former Minister of Transportation, Chrystia Freeland, the Minister of Public Safety, and the officials responsible for reviewing. They would be there in camera and not publicly. And C, we're missing the Secretary of State for Labor and Secretary of State for Revenue. They're not in the list of those invited. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador Duval. Mr. Lauzon. I agree with that.
Okay. So do we want to add that in now?
Yes, that was Christy Freeland, Minister Freeland. We're talking about section B, or we're on section C now.
I think it was B was Freeland. And okay, so B was Minister Freeland, former Minister Freeland, and C was Secretaries of State. Am I getting this right? Okay.
Section B. Okay, so we have Minister Freeland here. And then the committee will invite Minister of Transportation and Secretary of State. Was that in the original motion?
I believe it was. It's okay.
Original right here.
We'll get there.
This is the original one, completion of the study.
There you go.
Minister for Security of State for Labor and the
That in. I believe one of them was Henri Clos. There was the Public Safety Minister was in camera.
No, sorry, the staff of the
The
public
staff
safety
was in-
minister,
Gotcha.
and the minister was.
Was public. Okay.
Okay. You're just going to look at the original.
So colleagues, we're going to suspend for 1 more minute as members work with the clerk to ensure that the wording is exactly as requested. So the meeting is suspended to the call of the chair. to read the portions that have been changed so that we don't have to hear the entire amended motion, but go ahead, Mr. Clerk, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. We have at Section B, it reads as follows with the amendment. As part of its study on Canada Infrastructure Bank's loan for new BC Ferries vessels, the committee will hold 3 additional meetings and invite the following witnesses. Davie Shipyard, Ocean Group, Seaspan Shipyards, Irving Shipbuilding, BC Ferries and Marine Workers Union, BC Building Trades, BC Federation of Labor, the Shipyard General Workers Federation, the United Steelworkers, the Canadian Association of Steel Producers, former Minister of Transport Chrystia Freeland, the Minister of Public Safety, as well as officials responsible for reviewing national security issues related to the connection between BC Ferries and the Chinese shipyard merchants industry, Waihei Shipyard in camera, and the Ontario Shipyard. And then
Just to confirm, that's the officials only for in camera, that the Minister of Public Safety will be in public.
We're all in agreement with that, correct? Yes.
Yards? Ontario?
It has an S on it.
shipyards.
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you.
okay.
Section C. The language in Section C was changed from summon. The committee will invite the Minister of Transportation, the Secretary of State for Labor, and the Secretary of State for Revenue to testify in this study for a minimum of 1 hour each. And that completes the changes.
Colleagues, we've heard the final version of the motion as amended. Are there any comments or questions? Seeing none, we are now prepared to go to a vote on the motion as amended. Or actually,
I think we just passed on unanimous.
are there any objections to passing the motion as amended unanimously? Seeing none, the motion is adopted, colleagues. The clerk and I will get to work on this. And with that, the meeting is adjourned.